In this video, we're going to take a look at modifying curved components. All curves have a start and an end, and this is a very important part of understanding how curves function. Let's create a simple curve. So we'll go to Create, Curve Tools, and we'll use our more friendly CV curve tool as opposed to the EP curve tool. That CV curve tool is always just a little bit more manageable when moving those control points. I'm going to drop down here a couple of points just by left clicking. And when we reach the end, I'm just going to hit enter to complete the curve. Now, what I really want to look at here is that start and end positioning of our curve itself. So I'm going to go into a component mode to take a look at the control vertices. And I'll do so by pressing the F8 hotkey, which globally moves me into component mode. That would be for every object in the scene. We only have a single curve here, so that's the only item or node that goes into a vertex component mode. And we can see that component mode up here in our component selections. When I look at the curve, I can now see there is a open square box at one end. Then it goes to a U, that's the letter U, and then to a normal dot or control vertex. And if I zoom out, you'll see that the rest of the points on that curve are just dots like this one here. So what this is telling me is that the square open box here and the U is the start of my curve. Curves have two directions, U and the V. When we draw the curve, it's always going to draw in the U. Eventually, when we actually build a surface using curves, we'll then have two perpendicular curves, one of which will be going in the V direction and the other in the U direction. But the curves themselves, when we draw them isolated, are always drawn out in the U. Not really all that important to remember, but just so that you can see there that U tells me what direction the curve is going in and that this is the beginning of the curve. Hit F8 again to go back to object selection, basically backing me out of that vertex mode, and we'll just delete that. And since I already used the tool, I'm going to go to my last tool used over here in the toolbox and just double click it. And that's going to bring up the tool settings for my CV curve tool. When we draw a curve, we can draw it in several different ways. Now, there's really only two that we want to focus on here, and that is linear and cubic. I'm going to switch to linear real quick. And again, I'm just going to start to drop down a couple points, and you can see pretty quickly the difference in the curves that we've been drawing previously. A linear curve has no interpolation between the points. It goes from point A to point B, straight line, linear. When we use cubic, there is interpolation between the points, and it does its best to create a curvature. Now, there's all different cases where we may choose one over the other. If we are building something that has more of a hard surface, like a box or even a computer or some forms of furniture or metal, all of these things are going to be a little bit closer to a linear type curve. More organic stuff, we end up using a cubic type curve. I'm going to delete those again and go back to my last tool, and we'll stick with cubic here. And let's just shut that down to get some more real estate here. So now when I draw my curve, I have a couple of options. First, when I click, our points get dropped down. Now, before I complete the curve, you can notice lines that are being drawn here are a different color. They're orange, and I'm actually not even seeing my curve yet. What these lines here are called are hulls. These hulls show us which points connect to what. The curve itself is not being created yet because we have a cubic curve. And with a cubic curve, it requires more than 3 points in order to be completed. Whereas a linear curve, we only need 2. And when we look here, every single one of these basically needs one more point than what we actually see here. So if we were drawing a curve degree of 7, I would need 8 points in order for that curve to actually be represented. Otherwise, it's a bad node and you really have to delete it. It's not going to function. So when I drop my fourth point, we can now see that that curve has been created. Let's drop one more point. And now as I drop those points, what I can do, if I don't like the positioning, I can middle mouse before completing the curve and relocate that. Now I can't go back here, unfortunately. We can only get back to a previous point by completing the curve and then going into a component selection. Or we could choose delete, and that would delete my current point and then allow me to get back to a previous point. Middle mouse and drag. I'm still in the curve creation mode so that I can continue to click. Now, another thing I can do is when I click, I can hold the left mouse button down and relocate that point. These lines here are called hulls, and they're just showing us what points are connected to what. And these are useful because the control vertices themselves do not sit directly on the curve, and the curve itself is interpolated between each point. So sometimes it can be difficult to see which points belong to which curve. Those hulls basically connect the dots and show us. So I'm going to complete that curve. And instead of hitting F8, I can right-click on the curve and go to Control Vertex. And that just lets me get into those components. And when I right mouse click over the object, that only changes that particular object. Any other object in the scene would remain in object mode. Now I can back out of this by hitting F8 or by right mouse clicking and going to object mode. Now I'm going to bring up the attribute editor, slide this over here. We can go in and turn on our components while still in object mode through the attribute editor. So I go to the curve shape node and I can click on display CV, display EP, or display hull. This way I can see all of my components while still in object mode. And this can be very useful, especially when we're trying to snap points to this object. Perhaps we're creating a network of curves that all need to either intersect or connect end to end. Being able to see where those points are, obviously extremely helpful. We cannot individually select those points at this stage because we are still in object mode. We would have to go into component mode, right-click, and then we can choose or hit F8 to go directly to Control Vertex.